I want to try to tackle a very big question tonight, and I know that when one focuses on technology and policy, one always focuses on specific verticals. What's going on the internet and telecom, energy, healthcare, many different areas. But I want to try to tackle a much broader question, and I have my own views on how to answer it and how to think about it. But mainly I want to get people to just think about it and engage in this somewhat bigger question. And the question is something along the following lines. Are we still living in an accelerating technological civilization? Or are we living in a time when technological progress is decelerating and stalled out? And just to sort of set this question up a little bit more, I think the question of technological progress is an incredibly important part of the 19th century story of never-ending progress. It is an incredibly important part of how our whole system works and how we think about what's going on in our society. Maybe there are problems with political correctness or art or literature or various other things, but as long as the technology story is intact and is going well, there's nothing that you really need to worry about. And then conversely, if something is actually not quite right with the state of science and technology, we have some really deep problems. Now, I think this question about science and technology has become more acute since the Great Recession that began in 2008 and that has no end in sight. And we sort of need science and technology to help us escape from it in a way. And we can avoid thinking about how to compete with China and India for low-paying jobs as long as science and technology will provide high-paying jobs. And we can, we don't need to worry about the runaway welfare state, or we have our retirement 401k plans where we expect runaway growth in the stock market, and we can expect all these things to just work out as long as science and technology are happening, even though for many of us in much of our country, it's become very hard to separate science from superstition and technology from magic. And these things are, it's very hard to actually get a handle on what is really going on. So I think this question is very important. And as soon as we ask the question, we run into an almost immediate problem, which is that science and technology have become extremely specialized. There are all these different things going on. And so any of these fields take almost half a lifetime of study to master. So what's really going on in string theory, or quantum computing, or breakthrough nanotechnology, or 610 other fields that I could enumerate or try to enumerate. And so this incredible specialization leads to the sense that it's very hard to get a handle on this question. Now, I think just because the question is hard, we shouldn't avoid answering it, and I want to try to give my cut at an answer, and why at least I find it to be somewhat worrisome that things are perhaps making less progress than is generally advertised or believed to be the case. As a first cut to trying to get a handle on this question, let me just sort of give a bird's eye view on a whole series of different verticals. And when we look at many different fields outside of computers and the internet, and I'll come back to those later, we find that there's been less progress than people were expecting in the 1950s and 1960s, where people admittedly had many lofty hopes for the future. And but we have seen both less progress in the last 40 years, and our expectations for future progress have also been correspondingly reduced. To take both a very narrow and very literal example, we are not moving faster. If you look at transportation, it got faster and faster, and one of the most basic ways to measure progress was that you would move faster. And so you had faster sailing ships throughout the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. And then you had faster railroads in the 19th century, and faster cars and faster planes in the 20th century. And this whole trend started to be reversed with the decommissioning of the Concorde in 2003, to say nothing of the increasingly nightmarish security rules, which are incredibly low-tech and have probably put travel back in a velocity to something like 1960 in the U.S. If you anybody today who talks about space jets, lunar vacations, flying cars, is someone who's probably coming from another planet. And you sort of go back to the 1964 Popular Science headline cover story, who will fly you at 2,000 miles per hour? Answer, nobody, 47 years later. And more generally, it's not even a question that registers an important question anymore. We don't even worry about the fact that nobody is even talking about this. And so it's something that's both off the grid, it's been a failed expectation, and it's one we're not even talking about. Now, if we drill down to why has transportation slowed down, there are many different reasons, but probably the number one area I would cite would be escalating fuel costs and the lack of innovation in the much more important energy sector. And again, if you just look at price indicators as a basic thing, we have runaway prices. Real oil prices at this point are higher than they were during the Carter catastrophe of 1979, 1980. And expectations have been reduced across the board. In 1974, Nixon, in his State of the Union speech, promised that we'd have 100% oil independence by 1980 in the US. Fast forward 37 years to 2011, Obama's State of the Union speech, 2011, promised 1/3 oil independence by 2020. So lower expectations further in the future, to say nothing of the fact that tremendous amounts of time has elapsed. I think the nuclear industry was dead decades before the Japanese accident at Fukushima. You could not, in good conscience, encourage an undergraduate today to study nuclear engineering as a career with much of a future. And instead, there has been a focus on a lot of these clean technologies, which unfortunately are even more expensive than ever more expensive oil. And so one has to ask whether the future in the 21st century will not be even more expensive solar, algae, wind as an alternative to escalating oil costs, but whether it will not involve maybe a regression to the past, say to the 19th century, which was basically coal. And if I were to at least sort of as an anecdotal side use Warren Buffett as a prop here, his one all-in bet was in the railroad industry in 2009, which is the single biggest investment Berkshire Hathaway has made. And if you look at the railroad industry in the U.S., that is a bet that will work if there's no energy and no transportation innovation. 40% of what gets transported in railroads in the U.S. is coal. And so Buffett is basically making not only an all-in bet in America, which is the way he described his investment in railroads, but also an all-in bet against the future, and that the future will look much more like the 19th century in the United States. When we go beyond the energy sphere, the sort of crisis of escalating prices as a result of stalled innovation is basically in the last decade been found in almost all commodities. If you look at a basket of 25 commodities, 24 of the 25 have gone up tremendously in price in the last decade. The one borderline exception is natural gas, which is basically flat on the decade. The commodity price increases in the last decade have more or less offset the gains of the previous century. They've been bigger than the commodity shocks of World Wars I, World War II, bigger than the 1970s. To just focus on one specific area, food production, this is an area where a technological famine may actually result in a real old-fashioned famine. The Green Revolution, which happened in the 1950s, 1960s, increased agricultural yields by something like 125% between 1950 and 1980. Since 1980, agricultural yields have increased by only about 46%, which is decent, but marginally less than the worldwide rate of population growth, and so not quite enough. And so we've seen sort of this, the failure of a green revolution, I think in some ways has given way to this sort of very different type of a green revolution in the Middle East, which is often sort of embellished as a fortunate byproduct of the information age, but we should not forget is primarily the direct cause of desperate people who've become more hungry than scared. And we have to realize that the big thing that drove the Arab Spring in the last year was basically food prices that went up 40, 50, 60%, and that this was sort of like a somewhat delayed response to this massive lack of innovation in agriculture. Biotechnology, medicine, I think there's been some progress in the last 20, 30 years, but even there, I think one sees, if not a complete stall, at least some sort of deceleration. Life expectancy is increasing, but at a slightly slower rate. So, and of course, if you look at the drug pipeline, there's much less in the pipeline. The big pharma companies are expected to lose about 1/3 of their revenues in the next 3 years as patents expire. And in a somewhat perverse but understandable response, have basically decided to just begin the wholesale firing of all the scientists and researchers that produced so little work in the last decade and a half. And of course, on a public policy level, there's also much less of a sense of the future. So basically, in 1970, Congress in the US could still declare that by 1976, within 6 years, cancer would be defeated. War on cancer was declared in 1970 with the hope of winning it in 6 years by 1976. Today, 41 years after 1970, we are by definition 41 years closer to defeating cancer, but few people would say that we're 6 years away. So again, we have sort of a lot of time has elapsed, expectations have been reduced, and if we were to transpose this to other contexts, it would be very hard to get something like this started. So, you know, my sort of top candidate would be that we should declare a war on Alzheimer's. Close to half the people in the US who are 85 years old are suffering from some form of dementia. But politically, this is not even in the intellectual universe of what can be discussed in our system today. And it's again, is a reflection of how much science and technology have failed and how much expectations have really been dialed back in the last 4 decades. I do think the one very big exception is computers, the internet, to some extent the mobile internet as an extension of the computer age. Moore's law has kept going unabated in the last 40 years, and you have certainly all sorts of parts to that in Silicon Valley that one can point to as being extremely successful. I've been involved in a lot of them. I believe these companies are all great companies. I think they're doing great things. I don't think it should be minimized or regulated for that matter. But I do think one has to ask the question: how does one measure what the importance is? And just to pick on Apple Computer Company, I'm not involved with in any way. If Steve Jobs were here giving a speech, he would tell you that this iPhone is the most significant technological innovation in the US in the last decade. And that certainly is what Time Magazine and the various people who evaluate these things would agree with. And yet we should also ask, is this on par with the Apollo program, on par with things like that? Is it even bigger in ways we can't quite measure? Or is it less so? And so I think the question we have to ask with computers and the internet is, how does one measure these things which have happened and have been very successful in comparison to all these other areas where we can point to failed expectations, slow down, reduced progress? Now, if I had to sort of give one basic metric for how to evaluate it, I think you can try to evaluate it directly on a science and technology basis, and there is infinite complexity there. So I've given just an inkling of the kind of complexity one has if you try to measure it directly. So it's like food production versus Moore's law versus oil prices versus alternatives to oil versus we have the Dreamliner. Isn't that maybe that's better than the Concorde because it's safer and it's a revealed preference on the part of consumers? And so you have infinite amounts of complexity in all of these debates that one can have. The indirect way that I would suggest you measure whether or not we're making lots of technological and scientific progress is through economics. Are people's living standards meaningfully higher than they were 40 years ago? And I think the single big reality is that wages, incomes have been stagnant to only modestly improved since 1973. We have a lot of debates why this has happened. I think people on the right tend to ignore this fact. People on the left tend to attribute it to increasing inequality in wealth and income distribution. I tend to think both are quite wrong. I think there has actually been stagnation. I think there has been some increased inequality, but I don't think that's the main driver. I think the main fact is just that there's been basic stagnation. The numbers are that median wages in the US have gone up by only 10% since 1973. If you look at mean wages, which factors in the increased inequality, that's gone up by 29%, which sounds a lot better, but is still a really anemic 0.7% a year. If you add in health care benefits, which have been about an extra $2,600 per person since 1973 in 2011 dollars, that gets you an extra 0.2% a year, or 0.9% growth in wages per capita since 1973. And parenthetically, this assumes that you believe the government's inflation numbers, which we have reasons to believe are understated. If there is more inflation than people think is going on in the US, just by 0.9% a year, then things have been completely flat since 1973. I believe there has been quite a bit more inflation. My two big candidates for where there's been more inflation are in all the various government areas, specifically education and healthcare. Education costs have quadrupled since 1980, and people assume that it's just the quality's gone up by a factor of 4. If you assume that there's been no big quality improvement, then you've had a huge hidden inflation in education. Healthcare is more complicated. I think there's been some progress in healthcare, but also a lot of hidden inflation. And if you just factor in education and healthcare, you very quickly get to the idea that the economics have basically been flat since 1973. That was the year when you had the oil shock, when OPEC quadrupled oil prices, and it suggests that this was an extremely important event. And so if I had to sort of give a summary of the economic, technological history of the last 40 years, I would say that basically there's been insane progress in computers, internet, all the things related to that. It's been offset by incredible failure in energy, and to first order, the two things have canceled each other out, and it's been like Alice and the Red Queen's race in Alice in Wonderland, where we and our computers have been forced to run faster and faster and faster just in order to stay in the same place. Now, I think, and I think this gets you to a place that's very different from the policy consensus, which is that we're in an era of breathtaking progress, where things are changing and the rate of change itself is changing, and all the other bromides that we get told about this stuff. And one way to sort of understand how far the economics have diverged from what people expected 40 years ago is just to remember the kinds of things people were saying 40 years ago. One of the books I recently reread was written in 1967 by Zerban Schreiber, The American Challenge. And the basic thesis was that the US had an exponentiating technological civilization, and as a result, it would accelerate ahead of the rest of the world. And the differences between the US and Europe were going to grow from differences of degree to differences of kind. And within 40 years, the developed world would consist of the US, Canada, Sweden, and Japan, and that would be it. And then the rest of Europe would fall behind, and it would be as far separated as Europe was at the time from Nigeria or Egypt. And that's what an accelerating technological civilization would look like. In terms of what it would mean for people in the US would be that they would have to compete less with people in the rest of the world because everybody else would be left so far behind. The average work week, according to Zerban Schreiber in 1967, by the year 2000, was going for the average person, not for creative people or executives who like their work, but for the average person, the average work week would be 4 days a week, 7 hours a day, with 13 weeks of paid vacation. And for the first time in history, you were going to have a civilization in which people had more days off than they were working. And we like to dismiss it on the basis, well, he was French. And I'm not entirely unsympathetic to that dismissal, but I think we should also step back and ask why these expectations were so far off and why we've been so far in missing them. If one, and I sort of as just one other parenthetical aside on the economics question, today when we talk about the world, economy, we normally talk about the developing and developed worlds, and this is sort of the basic framework people use. The one sort of rhetorical observation I'll make is that these categories are very interesting from a globalization perspective. You know, the developing world is basically, it has the business model of copying things that work in the developed world, and you can sort of look at China and it's doing that really well, and then there are other countries that are doing it less well or somewhat well, and you have this whole range within the developing world. But it's basically an anti-technological framework. If you use the categories developed and developing worlds, you're implicitly assuming there's going to be no technological progress, because the developed world means that you're at the end of the S-curve and you're in a basically static world which is fully developed. And the question of how do you develop the developed world doesn't even get into the discussion. And in fact, the way you've defined the categories suggests it's not even a relevant question, that we're in fact in a static developed world. And the only part that's interesting is sort of for the emerging markets to catch up, and they will sort of catch up, and then that will change the world in interesting ways, because technology is more or less static and frozen. And that's implicit in these categories, even though it's normally not brought out. And you have to go back and read stuff from the 60s to see how differently people used to think about the future. I want to just sort of a lot more we can talk about, and want to open it up to some question and answers and some back and forth discussion, but I want to just draw out maybe 3 implications of this time of decelerated technology. One sort of economics, finance, one political, and one more sort of cultural, or what we should do now. Economics, finance. The basic issue is that I think one can think of this entire finance credit crisis as a technology crisis, and it sort of maps onto it. And credit, like technology, involves claims about the future. I will gladly pay you $1 on Tuesday for a hamburger today is a statement about how much money you will earn by Tuesday, and so it's implicitly a statement about what your earning power will be like, what the economy will be like. And in a developed, advanced technological civilization, it's fundamentally a claim about how much technological innovation will happen between now and Tuesday. Or if you buy a house in Las Vegas on a 30-year mortgage, how much innovation will happen in the next 30 years that will gradually propel things. And when we're in a world where technology is decelerating, leverage becomes a lot more dangerous, because leverage works really well if you have this incredible background of progress. If things don't work, you can just print money, you can figure out various other ways to sort of address macroeconomic problems, and things will sort of gradually correct themselves, and you sort of coast your way out of it because things work. In a place where there's a tech slowdown, it becomes much more dangerous. And I think this sort of suggests a very different way of thinking about the strange way in which the 90s tech bubble gave way to the 2000s housing and finance bubble. And so if you look at it from the point of view of people trying to get very high returns, in the 90s, people were hoping for technology to do it. When technology didn't work as promised, they went into real estate and leveraged it up to try to get the double-digit returns they were looking for. But that was implicitly a bet on technology as well. And that's why I think the real estate bubble of the 2000s was much dumber than the tech bubble of the 90s, because at least the tech bubble in the 90s was about technology. It was about the real thing. The real estate bubble, people were still betting on technology. They just didn't know it. And then, of course, the leverage was both more dangerous and more tempting in this world where things slowed down. And I think we're now sort of dealing with this world where financial leverage doesn't work anymore, and people are sort of a bit lost and adrift in terms of what's happened in the economy and the financial market and how you get this started again. When one shifts the political sphere, I've begun to wonder whether our entire political system in the Western world depends on economic growth. And it basically works by saying that most people win most of the time, and the way legislative processes work is, we'll get something for my project, and we'll give you something for your project, and something for your project, and if you don't go along, you don't get anything for your project. And so everybody sort of gets along because it's a win-win situation in a growing economy. When there is no growth, there is a loser for every winner. And you basically end up with politics becoming increasingly nasty and zero-sum. And I believe that we're beginning to see this sort of a shift in the political sphere in both the US and Western Europe. And people tend to describe the incredibly bad tone of politics in both US and Western Europe, and I think they're very, very similar. They tend to describe it in structural terms, which is, it's like it's the Senate has too many arcane rules, but we've had the same Senate for 200 years, or to describe it in ideological categories, even though when you actually look at what people believe, there are almost no differences at all. It's sort of like it's weirdly exaggerated differences. I think it's mainly that there's no growth, and you need the growth to get things to work. I think this is something that's parenthetically very different from the 1930s recession, where in the 1930s people believed there was no growth, and they were scared of inflation, and they were scared of printing money, and they were probably in retrospect too scared of it. And so, the Fed pursued a very deflationary policy. The Keynesian response to that, even though it always feels like a bit of voodoo economics to me in a way, it actually kind of worked. And you could actually print money in the 30s because you had tremendous technological progress. And when you had a world where you had secondary oil recovery, and you had the aerospace industry getting started, and the movie industry getting started, and home appliances being built from scratch, and people's living standards in 1939 were much higher than 1929. You could have all sorts of crazy economic theories, and they could kind of work parenthetically. And the question about Keynesianism is sort of, why did it work for so many decades, even if we believe it's wrong? I believe it's wrong. I also believe it worked for many decades. I think it basically worked because we had this incredible tailwind behind us. The tailwind has come to an end. It's not working anymore. And so we have this weirdly different public policy debate today where we debate the economic and financial questions with much greater erudition. So I think Bernanke, Geithner, Larry Summers, all these people understand the 30s from a financial perspective much better than people in the 30s did. But the question of technology doesn't even register. And that is simply a cargo cult. It is basically, we don't understand how it works. The cargo has always come in the past. It's going to keep coming. And when the cargo doesn't show up year after year after year, this sort of age of financial bubbles gradually gives way to an age of austerity. And I think that's what we're starting to see. As someone who's politically somewhat on the right, let me just make one observation about how things have shifted on the right politically in the US in terms of thinking about economics. I think there's been a very big shift that people haven't talked about very much, which is sort of the optimism of Jack Kemp and supply-side economics to the pessimism of Ron Paul and the Tea Party. And it's basically this shift from the belief that you could cut taxes and increase spending to the idea that money is either hard or fake. And even though, and I think that, and I think we're just in the beginning of this shift. There's a left-wing version, there's a right-wing version of it, but I think we're seeing this inexorable shift towards austerity, both in the US and Western Europe, because people no longer have confidence that the future will be better. There is no problem with borrowing money and spending tons of money, or not a big problem, if you think things are going to be much better. If the economy doubles, if it grows at just 3.5% a year, it will double in 20 years, and you can double the debt. People will be twice as rich, they owe twice as much money. It all sort of works. It might not be the best way to do things, but it sort of works. If there is no growth, that becomes a catastrophic judgment. And this is sort of what people are starting to sense in the background. It is that, and it's when people ask, is the next generation in the US going to be better off than the current generation? And when you see the chart of that, and it steadily moves in a northeasterly direction, and at this point, large majorities think the next generation will be worse off than the current generation, completely at odds with what all the tech pundits say. That has this sort of deep political ramification, of which I think we're just beginning to see this. Now, I would say, let me come back to the question of what should now be done. I've just given sort of a very brief overview on This idea that there's been a tech deceleration in the last 40 years, most people don't agree with me. It's very complicated whether this has happened or not. So I think the question of whether or not there's been a tech deceleration is itself a difficult question. Let me just make it clear, I'm not answering the question of why such a deceleration has taken place. The question people always ask me, it's like this automatic, you can like push a button, is like, well, why has this happened? And let me just say, that's a much, much harder question than whether it's happened. I have tons of theories, a lot of crazy ones, some not so crazy, I think, but the why question is much harder than the whether or not it's happened question. And so I'm going to make a conscious effort to resist even trying to answer the why question. The question of what should be done today, and is there a role for trying to get the government, in particular, to reaccelerate technological innovation? And I think, I don't want to be too dogmatic about it, and the provisional answer I will give is that the answer is theoretically yes and practically no. And it's theoretically yes because there is a history where government has actually played a role in innovation. You can point to the Manhattan Project, the Apollo program. You can make the argument that basic research in science has a lot of the attributes of a public good and may not be produced in sufficient quantities by the free market. And yet, and you can look at, say, the New York Times editorial from 1945, the day after Hiroshima. And it was sort of talking about how, great the Manhattan Project had been. And it ended with saying, and gotten all this money invested in, and the result, quoting now, and the result, an invention, the nuclear bomb, was given to the world in 3 short years through government planning that it would have perhaps taken half a century for scientists, for prima donna scientists, to come up with on their own, unquote. Now let me just observe, in practice, we know that the New York Times doesn't write editorials like that anymore. And we know that this sort of gloating belongs to a very different time and very different place. If you had an Einstein write a letter to the White House today telling the president to start a Manhattan Project, it would get lost in the White House mailroom and it would not even get started. You could not possibly get it done in 3 years. You could not possibly get the Apollo project and get someone on the moon in 7 or 8 years. And we simply don't believe in this. Our government does not have many scientists and engineers. It does not listen to scientists and engineers. And all these sorts of engineering concrete views of the future are not part of the discussion. And if you were to concretize this on various public policy debates, I do not know of any major political leader, either Democrat or Republican, who would cut healthcare spending in order to free up money for biotech research, or who would cut the welfare state in general in order to free up money for large engineering projects. This is just not part of the discussion. Robert Moses, who built New York City and New York State, or Oscar Niemeyer, the architect of Brasilia, this sort of belongs to a different time and place when people had concrete ideas about the future. It's not the way people think about the future anymore today. And this is not, and I think that, I think the first step that we have to take in getting out of this mess that I would suggest is at least to realize that we're in this, that we're no longer living in a society that cares much about science or technology. We have spent 40 years in the wilderness, something like that. We've been pretending that it's an enchanted forest, and perhaps the first step in getting out of it is to acknowledge that we've been in something of a desert. And with that, let me open it to some questions, discussion. Thank you.
So how much of this do you think is due to, we've just become so risk averse that you mentioned pharmaceuticals, so the FDA makes it exceedingly difficult to do new drugs. The EPA makes it difficult to Now they're starting to crack down on the fracking process. So how much do you think society has just become so risk averse that we aren't willing to, the internet's a nice example because it was new and government wasn't there to stop it. But for other areas, we just seem to become more and more risk averse, and we aren't willing to take the chances that we might need to take to develop new kinds of things.
I'm very sympathetic to that narrative, and so yes, certainly in the 70s when Bill Gates was starting Microsoft, people weren't trying to preemptively regulate and outlaw the software industry. But let me just go back to the preemptive thing I tried to say in my talk, which is that the why question is the question people immediately go to, is why has this happened? And I believe the risk-averse thing, that's one of my theories. I have about a half dozen theories on why it's happened. It's the top one. It's the one it's the most politically correct one I can give. But I want to focus not on the why, but the whether first. And that's sort of like, going straight to the why, that immediately gets you into a very ideological debate. And I think we need to just start with the question of, has there actually been a slowdown? And we need to that's how I would encourage us to sort of orient our thinking about this. And if there has, then we need to be asking these questions. If there hasn't, the why questions become much more secondary and irrelevant. In practice, I find that the why questions distract from the whether questions, because when people ask why, and we say it's risk averse, and then you immediately get into an ideological debate about whether these regulations are good or bad, and then if you're on one side ideologically, you say, well, the regulations can't be that bad, and therefore there has to be a lot of progress, and that ends up being this completely backward way of, to my mind, avoiding the whole debate.
Yeah, I was just thinking a lot of pessimism on your part, and I was wondering, is that just a result of the economic downturn we're in, however severe? Were you saying the same thing in 2005, and will you be saying the same thing 5 years from now when we have a recovery, or is this just part of the chorus that everyone feels when we're in an economic downturn that we can't quite explain?
Well, I would say, I don't know whether it's pessimism or optimism. I'm personally actually more optimistic than I've been at any time in the last 20 years, because I find that there are surprisingly many people who agree with my diagnosis, whereas I've been giving versions of the speech for the last 2 decades, and so few people agreed with me that the fact that almost nobody saw the problems I did tended to simply reinforce my pessimism. Let me sort of second order thing is, I think the behavioral psychology stuff, we're too much focused on that. Is it pessimism? Is it optimism? Is it the animal spirits we need to return? Is it confidence or lack of confidence? And I think instead of thinking of these things as psychological categories, I would encourage us again to think of it in terms of scientific and technological, not psychological categories. And I think the move to psychology has been sort of a way we've avoided this. And we've had like all these bubbles, which had like a very big psychological component, the tech bubble, the credit bubble, the housing bubble, and we tend to focus heavily on psychology for good reason. But at the same time, I wonder whether the reason the psychology could be so run away was because there was some other underlying thing that was off, and I tend to think we should get back to that. Third point I would make, though, is I actually don't think that many people agree with this particular diagnosis of the tech slowdown as the cause for pessimism. Most people have ideological reasons for pessimism. They have structural reasons. Maybe it's a banking crisis, a housing crisis. It's not framed in terms of a question about science and technology at all. So even if I'm being infected by pessimism elsewhere, I think the reasons are quite different from the ones that are normally given.
Harold, well, as the token progressive, I find there's a lot in there that I agree with, actually, which you can, and I'm curious, therefore, for not to try to get into the cause, but for an observation. Do you find, in looking globally, that the center of faith in technology, faith in the future, the kind of optimism, one might almost say, the sort of transition that we saw in the previous century, say from England and Europe to the United States, has that United States spirit that was the mark of the 19th century and the 20th century transferred to other places globally in your observation?
Well, as a venture capital investor, I'm still focused very heavily on Silicon Valley. So that's still the place that seems the best. And there was a very big effort by many people in the tech industry to diversify into China and India in the last decade, and it's generally had pretty bad results. My own analysis of it is that in most of the developing or emerging countries, it's very straightforward what you're supposed to do. You're just supposed to copy the US and avoid some of the mistakes. So it's like we can do better urban planning, we can go straight to wireless, better energy efficiency. But it's basically like if you ask someone in China, what are things going to be like in 20 years? It's the basic plan is you copy the US with incrementally doing things better. And you can do pretty well in that sort of society, even if you don't do anything new. And so maybe you'll do well if you start a McDonald's franchise or a Starbucks, or you become a real estate developer or a highway construction person, or there's sort of all sorts of very standard things. And that's what I think talented people in most emerging market countries do. So I think if there is a different place where technology is happening, I would actually look at the developed world. And so I'd look at Western Europe, Japan, Israel, places like that. And I think you have this problem in a lot of these places. I think probably, but those are the alternative places we've looked at. Japan's too alien. It feels like some things may be going on there, but it's not something I can really understand that well. I think Western Europe, probably the most promising would be like Scandinavia. I think Israel's very interesting, but it's small. But I think you have to look at where do people actually have incentives to try to do new things.
Not to ask you about the cause, but one of the points that you made early in your speech, how to address hostility towards science. Because I think that was a very powerful observation you made, and it does go, I think, to the core of the problem you identified. So if you had a therapy to recommend, what would it be?
Yeah, this feels like you're trapping me into the why question, and let me. Or climate. We can do the climate change or the stem cells. Those are the ones the right tends to be the most skeptical of. I guess sort of my worry is that that a lot of the hostility to science is actually somewhat justified because it hasn't produced as much as people promised. And so if you ask, so there is sort of, I think, without answering the why question, I think there is both a cause and effect. And so I think in the 50s or 60s, scientists were on a pedestal, and people listened to them because there were all these really dramatic ways in which they were improving things and making things better. That's much less clear today. People don't, like, who's the equivalent of Einstein today? People wouldn't, it's not even part of our discussion, and it might be that the culture's hostile to science. It might be that we don't really have an Einstein equivalent. But the cultural fix, you read his book, The Elegant Universe, and it's basically through about 1960, it's one impressive theoretical discovery followed by practical experimental verification, and then the last 40, 50 years, it feels like postmodern literary theory. And so, I think it's a very well-written book, but you read it and you end up actually with a mild anti-science bias. But anyway, I don't. My my own solution on this is that I think it happens in pockets. It's isolated, and the challenge to people who are more progressive politically and believe in a bigger role for government is, can you actually convince the government to make this a priority? I think there are actually a lot of people in the Obama administration who sotto voce believe that there is a problem and somehow innovation is slowed down and stuff like this, but they don't even have the language with which to talk about it. And I think until they find the language with which to talk about it, you will not find a sort of collective political governmental solution. And that's why the kinds of solutions I gravitate towards are in these very isolated, small pockets. I don't even claim that's the best way to do it, but I don't believe I have a good way of changing the whole culture.
Do you realize who you're talking to here, the audience? I mean, do you know who these people are?
I believe this is a leading question.
No, I'm serious. I'm from TechCrunch, so I'm on your side, by the way.
Okay, so yes. Well, I believe I'm talking to a lot of people who are engaged with technology and policy questions in many different ways on a day-to-day basis, and who are in a much better position to have some gut check evaluation of whether what I say makes a modicum of sense.
Well, I think the crowd here is...
I'm not necessarily answering your question quite the way you'd like me to.
Let me help you a little bit. The crowd here is a political audience. And I'm interested in terms of your, I don't know if it's a critique of science or a defense of science, but there's clearly a failure of the political class in this country. I'm not accusing anyone here, of course, but what is the relationship between politics and science, and perhaps the failure over the last 40 years in America of turning politics into a science? How does the failure of political science tie into your theory of the crisis of science and politics?
Well, I don't have a strong view on political science. I'm not sure political science is that much of a science. But I think that I think to the extent that there's a crisis for the political class, it is the basic social compact is the political class, the establishment, the elite, whatever you want to call them. You get to rule the country as long as people get to be better off, and there is sort of a sense in which that compact has not quite been working the way it's supposed to, and that's why we're in this very chaotic political situation. And that's just, this is just sort of describing it. What one does is very hard to do. If my diagnosis is right, it tends to be something that's very hard for people to fix, because this is not even the place they're looking for problems, for the solution set. And so, if you were to talk to someone like Bernanke or some of the people on the monetary policy side, the technology component of the macroeconomic equation, that's just a variable you plug in. That just happens automatically. It's like this drift that happens in the background, and I think that's sort of the way people tend to think about it. And so you pay lip service to tech and innovation, and just sort of this thing that happens, and it's like magic. But the degree to which it's disconnected from it is part of the problem. But it's also why people tend to minimize it. People always tend to think that whatever they do is the most important thing. So if I had to give sort of the sociologic, it's like if you're a lawyer, you think law is really important. And if you're a real estate broker, housing is the most important thing in the world that you need to fix. And and if you're a computer scientist, engineer, you think computers are the most important thing. And if computers are working, then everything's working. And so there's always this self-referential thing. Our political class has a very small representation from science and engineering. I was looking at the numbers, and like 535 people in the House and Senate, and something like 30 have a background in science, technology, engineering, defining these terms pretty generously. And so the natural psychological bias, if I had to make I don't want to make too much of a psychological argument, but the natural psychological bias is think this can't be the place where the problem is. The problem has to do with regulations of finance. So it's like 2/3 of the people are lawyers, so it's naturally, the bias is, okay, it must be like the banking industry wasn't regulated properly, it was too regulated or not regulated enough or something like that, and it's about really, really smart people need to figure out the micro-regulatory stuff on finance or things like that. I think that's, so it's just an enormous blind spot people have.
You didn't answer the question.
How did I not answer it?
Well, I'm still looking for a solution to building a more credible political class.
Well, my answer is my answer is I'm not sure there is a direct political solution. So it's like, well, the voters can vote in different people. I suspect they will churn through lots of different candidates over the next few decades. But I would be extremely pessimistic if I thought the only solutions had to be political top-down, because to the extent the problem is not even listed in the top 10 list of problems, it's unlikely that this will be what will be solved. So, I have my political views. At the same time, I'm not despondent, because if I believe that the only solutions could happen through politics, I would probably just hide in the ground and not even be talking to people. Hide my head in the ground.
Nigel Cameron, I run a think tank in DC that's been trying for 2 years to try to get the discussion focused longer term on the impact of technology and the significance of these things. And this may help Andrew, because it ties in with his question. And I buy a lot of your analysis. I mean, the Washington I work in is not the Washington in which the Department of Energy and the NSF and the NIH and NASA, were established. It's not the Washington, of Vannevar Bush. It's the Washington of the other Bushes and their successors. And in this context, I was in the Valley for the last few days, visiting various people. And I find an extraordinary commonality between the Valley and DC. The commonality is you mentioned the other, and eyeballs roll. Now, as it's been said, I mean, DC, and you were saying this yourself, views innovation as a sort of ATM. It's that kind of view of it. In the Valley, the level of sort of caustic cynicism about the policy community is really quite profound, And I think perhaps maybe the single largest risk element in America's future. And I've written about this as a suicide pact between the Valley and DC. Now, my question to you is, how do we build the bridge? How do we build the bridge to somewhere which basically begins to merge the political culture, the corporate culture of the Valley, the Bay Area, the creative, the visionary community, and the policy community, which ultimately sets the parameters within which everything operates in our system of governance? Now, if we can find out how to do that, incrementally, seems to me, that's the way to get back to the Washington of NASA, NIH, NSF, Vannevar Bush's vision, and we begin to move ahead.
I'm still going to try to dodge that question, because I think that's another hidden form of the why question. And so, obviously, one kind of answer to the why is that there's not been a good enough partnership between Silicon Valley and Washington. And that's certainly, not going to necessarily question any of your specifics. But I don't know if that's the primary driver on the why. And I'd say that the big, on the political level, the why is mainly people don't think there's a problem. They don't, and I think they think there's a problem neither in DC nor in Silicon Valley. And this is one thing they have in common, is both DC and Silicon Valley are very bullish on technology. And so in Silicon Valley, you're bullish on tech because that's the way you talk your book. If you're an entrepreneur, tech's going to work. You're in a great company. If you're a scientist at a university, you just need $1 million more and you're going to get the cure for cancer. If you're a venture capitalist, maybe you're even worse, and it's just everything's great. And then the government side, it's like, well, everything's sort of, lots of stuff screwed up in the US except for technology. And so I would say, from my perspective, the bigger problem is not that there's huge acrimony between Silicon Valley and DC, but it's the fact that they have a common blind spot in that both of them believe that we're living in this incredible age of technological acceleration, and it's the cargo cult mentality is disturbingly, is the one thing they disturbingly have in common. So again, I think I want to avoid the why question, but I would take the why question on the political thing in a completely different direction.
Hi. Fascinating. I think that maybe you should take some of your investments and money and look into funding a major campaign to change the way that money plays in politics in this country. Because I think that if you really want to examine what's wrong with the policy community and the political community in Washington, a good place to start, anyway, is the incredible amount of time that congressmen and others spend raising money and the kind of money that corporations give in order for these kinds of questions that you are interested in not to be looked at. They want their own interests taken care of as opposed to the interests of the common good. But that's not the comment that I want to make or the question I want to ask.
It's a why question again, so.
My real question is, I'm really quite stunned at your pessimism, and even though you say you're optimistic at your tone, because there has been in the last 20 years or so a major shift in the way things get done. Individuals who are extraordinarily rich now do things that once were done by governments and in some cases industry. And I think in particular what Soros did in Eastern Europe with the investments that he made in the NGOs prior to the fall of the wall. I think of Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation and what they've done in international health and what they're trying to do in water sanitation. I just think that there are more dimensions here that have to be considered when you look at the world and how the power centers of the world have shifted, particularly in this country, but also now increasingly overseas.
Let's see, there's so many different threads there. I'm not sure which one I want to take issue with, even though I disagree with every single thing you said. I'm not picking on you in particular. I think, look, I'll just repeat something I said. I agree it's a multidimensional problem. It's a problem that has many, many, many different dimensions and so many different ones, and you can point to all these different things, and there's this going on with, we have all these, we have, this going on with this foundation, these individuals, and there's this global stuff, and there's stuff happening in Africa, and there's such a, it's like this enchanted forest of so many different things that are happening, and it's dazzling and beguiling and enchanting. And so I think the question I want to try to ask to cut through the clutter is, how do you measure it? How do you sum it up? How does it all stack up? And I would say the simplest way I would stack it up is, are people better off in the US than they were 20 years ago? Are living standards going up? And I think the numbers are that things have been pretty stagnant since 1973. And so that's the one fact I will return to, and we can debate whether the economists are measuring things correctly. I think they are understating the amount of inflation, so therefore I think things are actually worse. But you respond with a 600 dimensional analysis, and then it's like, well, I can't rebut that, but I want to collapse it to one dimension. And I agree economics is not the only dimension, it's not the only thing that matters, but it is a first cut way to get at it. And when you take the average person and you ask them, do people think things will be better in 20 years? And they don't think so. That's a very powerful rebuttal. Now, they may be wrong and they may be stupid and we shouldn't have a democracy and we shouldn't have voters, but that's what people actually believe. And as long as we have a democracy, you should at least ask why people actually share something like this sort of a pessimism about the future.
A couple more questions.
Sure.
Yeah, first of all, very interesting, some great points. I agree with a bit of it, but let me challenge just conceptually where you get to. I think there are 2 points I'd like to make. One, looking at, you made reference to Apollo and Manhattan Project. they were the result of tremendous challenge, okay? Competition in survival in the war, competition by the Russians. So that kind of unique challenge, arguably, whether that is something we're going to face again that re-triggers it, and therefore kind of your baseline of looking at those kind of unique challenges that come out of if you will, competition at one level or another, you know, is maybe skews it a little bit. But those are, you also mentioned certain industries, aerospace, et cetera. I think it's conceivable that in certain arenas, if you will, tubular areas of society or science, that innovation takes place and then there's a diminishing returns. I mean, maybe there's another wave of innovation we can do in aerospace, but maybe we've just exhausted a lot of the curve potential in that area. But what about genetic engineering? What about some new areas that we really aren't thinking that much about? Materials research. Maybe aren't there other areas that we aren't now identifying that still have that great potential for major innovation that we haven't focused enough on yet? That the next aerospace, the next Manhattan Project could still be out there. But it takes a challenge, and in a way we haven't maybe felt that challenge to invest heavily in those areas yet.
Yes, okay, so again, many different, like I could probably spend an hour responding to this. Let me quickly try to respond to two separate points. So one is that the military has been driving innovation, so this is like the conservative sacrifice argument for technology, which is technology requires sacrifice, sacrifice is motivated by war, and then we run into the paradox where we have nuclear weapons, and so war doesn't make any sense anymore, and so we don't have a motivation to do it. And if I had to sort of finish your narrative, I would say that the space program ended in 1975 with the Apollo-Soyuz docking, and if we all realize we're all going to be friends, then why should we bother spending so much time trying to rack our brains out to invent stuff? I don't know if that's the right why narrative. I prefer the risk of reduction one, but the conservative sacrifice narrative is one that tells you, again, that we're headed for 100 years of stagnation because science and technology are too dangerous because they just kill people. And therefore, we have very powerful reasons we actually shouldn't do it. Now, are there some hidden verticals that people might look at that might be happening? So you have S-curves in aerospace and various other areas. I think there may be. There are sort of, but I would say it's if you look at what's actually going on, there are sort of failed expectations in many areas. The genomics area has been, frankly, quite disappointing. There was tremendous amount of effort put into it, and if you sort of looked at where Celera Genomics and various people like that were saying we would be in '99, it certainly has not lived up to those expectations. And maybe it's just at the beginning, and it takes longer, but then when it happens more quickly. And maybe we're just at the beginning of the accelerating arc. But I find it hard to find any really powerful areas outside of a continuation of the computer revolution, which I think still has a decent amount of oomph to it. But outside of that, it's been badly stalled. I spent some time with Eric Drexler, who wrote the Engines of Creation, the nanotech book in 1986 about how there was going to be this age of nanotechnology. In 2003, it was on sort of all these different ways nanotech was about to happen. And it's like, okay, it's 8 years later. There were some theoretical problems I pointed out to him at the time. It may be about to happen. I'm very focused on it. I'm very curious in it. I'm interested in funding it. I think it's important as a nonprofit, as a for-profit, as a society. But the question is where, and we need to make it concrete. Like the one thing that I want to push back on is whenever people talk about innovation, it's like there's just so much different stuff going on. We don't even bother to spend the time to pay attention to any particular details. And so we don't know why things are going to be better in 20 years. We just know they're going to be better because so many different people are doing stuff. And what I would much prefer is that we have a concrete, specific plan. This is the specific thing that we're going to do that will make things better. And I think if you look at the political public rhetoric on this, one of the reasons the pessimism is so endemic is because there is no specific story. If you ask a political leader, what are the ways in which things will be better in 20 years in the US, concretely how people's lives will be different, there is no credible story that people can tell. And so I think we should get away from the financial portfolio option theory of the future, which is basically there's just so much stuff going on, but I'm not going to bother to pay attention to anything in particular, to just one good particular idea. I'd be happy with just one good idea.
Well, I've got one good idea. I'd like to. Yes. We have one of the leading experts in productivity growth in the world here. And I am very skeptical of your claim that there's been no increase in per capita standard of living since 1973. And I'd really love to hear what Dale Jorgensen has to say about this. So I mean, you know, there's a factual question here, and we have a lot of people speculating who really are not experts on this. So, you know, I would just make a plea that you at least share your thoughts about, at least factually, this claim that there's been virtually no growth in per capita income since 1973. So that's my challenge. Okay.
Parenthetically, I agree the productivity question is very important. I think that is what a lot of this turns on.
Hi, Ed Hurst. I wanted to see if you might elaborate on your comments with respect to the developing world, particularly vis-a-vis China. And the reason I ask is, when I go to China, I go to innovation conferences, things like that, the things that you're saying is the same thing they're saying, except that they do have a plan like the one you alluded to, in the sense that they talk about the need for self-reliant innovation. And they do have specific ways for getting there. Now, maybe the government-driven plan isn't the right way, but they certainly have a plan, and they definitely would agree with what you're saying. And I know you're big in obviously space technology, but in the sense that we've sort of abandoned some of ours on the government level, they at least are aspirationally trying to do that. And that makes me a little optimistic, both in the sense that we may benefit from what they're doing, A, and B, it may lead eventually to the type of competition that Ed Black was referring to in the past. So I wonder if you could elaborate, not on the developing world generally, but with respect to what's happening in China, particularly the thought process among their elites compared to ours.
You know, I'm not an expert on everything that's going on in China, and so, you know, I'll qualify it with that. I would say the judgments that I've made as a venture capitalist are that it's not a good place to invest as a venture capitalist, and that you know, people have not really made money in Silicon Valley who've tried to invest in China, and maybe they're not well connected, maybe it's corrupt, maybe there are other things wrong, but somehow it doesn't actually seem to be the place that's that good for technological innovation. On a just looking at it through that somewhat narrow prism. What I do think is the truth about China is that it still is a desperately poor country. You know, per capita incomes are 7% of the U.S. If you believe the renminbi is misvalued, maybe it's 15% on a purchasing power parity basis or something like that. And so there's tremendous room just to catch up by copying things. And so I tend to think, you know, the story of globalization is fundamentally a story of copying things that work. And the story of technology is fundamentally a story of doing new things. And you can sort of, whiteboard, you can sort of think of globalization as the x-axis. You go from 1 to n, we copy things that work. Technology is the y-axis. You go from 0 to 1, you do new things. And, you know, I tend to think a good 21st century will involve some combination of both globalization and technology. I think that from China's point of view, much of the next 20 years is just about the globalization vector. It's about copying things that work. I think there are certain problems they are very acutely focused on that we're not. The one technological area that I think China is aware of that the US is not is the way in which there are resource constraints on energy. And in particular, I believe that China's leadership very strongly believes that we're living in a commodity-constrained, resource-constrained world. Because of that, I think they have a fairly adversarial view of the relationship with the U.S. It's a fundamentally zero-sum world. They have to get the oil, and so I think the one sort of place where a lot of the engineering science ideas tend to impact the Chinese leadership, I believe, are in the direction of looking at what's going on in the world, and what they see happening is not a technological cornucopia. They see a famine, and they see like an increased conflict over resources, and so I think even though they have this prism on which they look through things, I think they end up with much more pessimistic conclusions than we would tend to in the U.S. And I'd say the energy dimension is the one where I think China probably thinks about the future the most concretely and tends to be extremely pessimistic.
For you on that is perhaps one reason that as an entrepreneur, people have difficulty there is maybe in another sense optimism, in the sense that they're quite determined to do their own innovation, even if that hurts their trade relations with other countries. I guess what I'm saying is that they recognize the problem that you're talking about, and they're making a determined effort to get that. Now, maybe it's the wrong solution to the problem. Maybe they don't understand the why here, let alone there, but they do perceive it, and I think it's in a lot of areas. And there were just some recent comments about their space program in the paper you might have seen, but I think they are determined to do that, and it's not just copying, I don't think.
Well, determination normally, in a healthy world, there should be a way for determination to manifest itself in constructive relationships with other people, where you can construct win-win relationships where we're determined to do something, and there's a way to do this where everybody can benefit. Speaking from a venture capital perspective, that's not true in China. Speaking, the Silicon Valley perspective on this is incredibly hostile to China. I think if you wanted to get people in Silicon Valley into one room from all these hostile competing companies, probably the one way you could do it would be to organize people against China, because they're tired of China stealing the intellectual property, sabotaging the IT businesses on one level after another. This is probably like the one thing where Facebook and Google would really deeply agree, right? And so we can sort of ascribe this to the fact that China is doing a lot better and doing all these things well, but this certainly I'll just channel Silicon Valley and say this is not the Silicon Valley perspective on it.
Well, as promised, this was a very provocative.
Thank you very much. Thank you very